file that mentions Project Cold Ones does not start with a name or a date. It starts with a sentence nobody in that system should have been careless enough to put on paper. They were alive, but the sensors said they were not there. That line sits alone on a blank sheet, clipped to the front of the folder like an apology that never became official. Below it, in red pencil, someone has added the project title in block letters. Cold Ones, Experimental Group, Unauthorized Copying Forbidden. You see the phrase unauthorized copying forbidden 100 times in these archives. It usually feels like routine. Here, it reads more like a warning to whoever might be tempted to believe what follows. The premise is simple in words and dangerous in practice. The USSR wanted humans with no heat trace. Not uniforms, not blankets, not tricks with background temperature. People. Bodies that left no infrared signature on the sensors that border guards and patrol aircraft and security cameras were learning to rely on. If you think in terms of paranoia and control, you understand at once why that would interest the kind of people who stamped this file. You also understand why, once you see how far they claim to have gone, you might want that interest forgotten. The official summary, typed in the flat language of internal reports, tries to push it back into normal science. According to the records relating to Project Cold Ones, Facility Y52 conducted observations of individuals whose infrared emissions deviated significantly from expected human norms. Comparative readings revealed a persistent anomaly inconsistent with instrument error. Subsequent attempts at replication produced destabilizing results in both thermal charts and observational logs. Project discontinued. Data retained for methodological review only. The phrase to notice there is both thermal charts and observational logs. It suggests that something changed not only in the way bodies appeared on instruments, but in the way people wrote about what they saw. The folder is thin by the standards of bomb tests or reactor incidents. It is thick by the standards of things everyone agreed to forget. On the inside of the cover, in faint graphite, someone has written, "These files feel colder than the room." Facility I-52 was one of those places that did not officially exist, but still needed electricity, groceries, and fresh air. On internal maps, it appears as a block of anonymous buildings in a strip of forested steppe, close enough to a small town to borrow workers, far enough that no tourist would ever wander within sight of its fences by accident. The photographs show low concrete, narrow windows, a central heating plant with a tall exhaust pipe, all painted in the same institutional color that loses its name after a while. The facility's primary cover story was environmental instrumentation. In simpler terms, they built and calibrated devices that told other people whether something was too hot, too cold, or about to leak. It made sense on paper to attach an infrared laboratory there. Thermography was, for a time, a quiet obsession of the state. Cameras that turned heat into false color images, lenses that could see tanks through fog, sensors that promised to reveal the living body behind any wall. Buried in that work is where Project Cold Ones starts. The earliest sign in the file is a set of calibration records that do not look particularly suspicious until you read them with the project's title in mind. One night, technicians at I-52 were running a routine sequence to check an infrared camera destined for an airfield. They had a standard target, a heated plate, a set of cylinders at known temperatures, and a human volunteer who would walk across the field of view to prove the system could see a person as a bright, unmistakable shape. The volunteer that evening was a young man from the maintenance crew. On the written log, his name is removed. On the thermal printout, he is just supposed to be a white silhouette against gray. According to the record, the heated plate and the cylinders all showed up where they should, at the right intensities. The background was the expected noisy haze. The technician logged the start of the human pass, counted out loud as the man crossed the marked line, and watched the screen. Nothing appeared. On the visible camera, mounted next to the infrared lens, the man is plainly there. A dark coat, a slow, uncertain walk. A glance back toward the technicians as if he is not sure which mark they mean. On the thermal channel recorded at the same time, there is only the background pattern and the faint geometry of the calibration frame. At the time, they should have seen a column of heat. They see a faint, cooler smudge, like a patch of sky. They assumed a fault. The technicians checked the lens cover, the sensor, the connections. They brought in a second person to walk the line. That figure appears immediately as a bright-shaped blot of energy, exactly as the manual promised. The maintenance worker crosses again behind him, visible in the visible spectrum, invisible in infrared. When he stands still near the heated plate, his outline only shows as a slight mellowing of the plate's brightness, as if he is absorbing some of its radiation rather than adding his own. The first report calls this non-standard subject contrast. The technician's handwritten comment in the margin is more honest. He does not register as alive on the sensors. At that point, this is still an anomaly to be ironed out, not a project to be funded. The supervising engineer orders a medical check. The maintenance worker is examined. Pulse normal. Temperature at the forehead normal. Reflexes normal. A doctor taps his skin with the back of his hand and feels standard warmth. Nothing glows on any instrument beyond baseline. The doctor's language is precise in the way of someone trying not to say something too loudly. No evidence of illness or metabolic disturbance. Subject physically unremarkable in direct examination. Discrepancy appears confined to radiometric representations. If you had any imagination at all, that sentence would bother you. The man feels warm. The camera says he is cold. One of those has to be wrong, or both are incomplete. The engineer at I-52 tries to close the case the practical way. He orders further tests, this time with multiple devices and multiple wavelengths. They test the man with 3 different infrared cameras, a makeshift array of thermocouples taped to his skin, and an old-fashioned clinical thermometer. Each time, the pattern repeats. Contact sensors give readings within human range. Remote sensors show almost nothing. At most, a pale disturbance, a hole in the field rather than a source. The report from this expanded test contains the first appearance of the phrase "cold ones," though not yet capitalized. A senior technician, writing for himself rather than for the archive, notes, "Others appear as bright figures. He appears as absence. Among the images on the wall, he looks like one of the cold ones from outside." From outside here means the environment the lab is supposed to monitor. Winter fields, bare trees, metal structures. To the thermal camera, a human should be the thing that insists on existing against that background. This man insisted on not existing in that band. The sensible explanation would be faulty equipment or subtle procedural error. I-52's internal monitoring unit, the people who existed to suspect such things, step in to check. They retest the devices. recalibrate them with known targets, swap sensors between setups. The anomaly persists only with that individual. Others glow, he does not. They consider and exclude simple cheating. No hidden cooling packs, no special clothing. They record him in just a light cotton shirt. To the air around him, he is warm enough that breath condenses faintly in front of his mouth in the cold chamber. To the sensors, he is a mild depression in background intensity. This is where the security apparatus crosses the threshold from mild curiosity to interest. An internal memo, translated, phrases it like this. Recent calibrations at I-52 indicate the presence of a subject whose radiative signature is markedly below expected and inconsistent with physical examination. Given current and future reliance on infrared systems in border, air defense, and facility protection roles, any deviation in human detectability has direct security relevance. Recommend dedicated examination under controlled conditions. That recommendation carries the first formal use of the name, Project Cold Ones, preliminary designation. From that point, the file stops being a pile of odd maintenance logs and becomes a project folder. They remove the maintenance worker from his regular duties. His reassignment is recorded as internal training. To his colleagues, he simply stops appearing on the roster. To the project, he becomes Subject 1. Later, entries suggest they did not stop at him. Security searches across several facilities turned up a handful of other individuals whose thermal records had raised questions in the past, but were written off as equipment issues. People who had been scanned at checkpoints or during health campaigns and appeared strangely flat on the thermal prints. Most had remained unnoticed because no one looked closely. Project Cold Ones looked more closely. In total, they quietly assembled a small group. A guard from a distant border post, a lab assistant from another institute, a clerk who had once been told to stand closer to the camera because the image looked weak, and one person whose origin is redacted entirely. The file calls them Subject 1 through Subject 6. All 6, according to the medical annex, showed no obvious illness. They came from different regions, different diets, different work environments. Their blood tests vary within the usual limits. Their visible injuries, scars, fractures match their stories. If you met them in a corridor, you would not mark them as extraordinary. Only the sensors disagreed. The early project notes read like someone trying to map out a new sense. Researchers described discovering they had been walking around with an unrecognized category all along. One entry, written by a physicist who seemed to be half intrigued, half annoyed, puts it this way. Our instruments are designed to draw a clear line between warm bodies and the cold world. These subjects sit on that line in a way we did not plan for. The devices see nothing where our hands feel life. Either our definition of nothing is wrong, or our sense of touch is an unreliable witness. Project Cold Ones operates inside I-52, but slightly to one side of the official floor plan. They take over an old concrete basement originally built for material testing. Its walls are lined with insulation. The only windows are narrow vents near the ceiling. One end is dominated by a thick door and a row of panels that feed power and signals to the testing rigs. Within that space, they build what the file calls the corridor. The corridor is a long, narrow room with infrared cameras mounted at regular intervals along its length, facing inward from both sides. The floor has a faint grid painted on it for reference. The ceiling is crowded with cables and sensors. The idea is simple: to create a space where, in theory, any human moving through must appear, unmistakably, at multiple points in space and time. Subjects are asked to walk the length of the corridor, pause at marked spots, turn, sit, lie down. The cameras record. Observers in the control room watch the feeds in visible light and infrared simultaneously. The first walkthroughs with control subjects, ordinary staff, work as advertised. On the visible screens, people move through the corridor. On the thermal screens, glowing shapes move in lockstep, bodies radiating into the cooler air, footprints fading behind them. When Subject 1 makes his first pass, the visible channel shows a young man in an ill-fitting lab coat walking slowly, glancing up at the cameras with an almost apologetic look. The thermal screens show a faint ripple where he steps, as if someone is gently stirring the air and leaving a cooler wake, but nothing that looks like a body. At one point, he stops, turns to face one of the cameras directly, and raises his hand. In visible light, his face is plain, narrowed eyes, a tight mouth, the expression of someone unsure why he is here. On the thermal feed, the frame shows the wall behind him and the faint shadows of the camera's own mounting points. His raised hand is no brighter than the metal bracket next to it. Observers report feeling a physical chill in the control room when they watch that sequence. The air temperature on the recorded instruments does not change. The notes from those early days are full of this kind of dissonance, more in human reactions than in numbers. The technicians know the devices. They trust them. They also know what it feels like to stand next to a living person. Project Cold Ones forces them to choose, repeatedly, between those trusts. At first, the researchers do what you would expect. They treat this as a question of measurement. They vary the wavelength bands, the integration times, the angles. They bring in different models of camera, including foreign ones acquired through various channels. They compare emissions in other parts of the spectrum. In every configuration, the subjects remain stubbornly low contrast in infrared. One researcher notes that if you average a large area around their bodies, you do register a small amount of excess heat, a few tenths of a degree. It just refuses to organize itself into the contour of a person. It spreads evenly, the way warmth from a radiator might if you stood far enough away and blurred your eyes. He writes, "It is as if their heat forgets who it belongs to." The security side of the project is less interested in metaphors. They want answers in categories like controllable, trainable, deployable. Someone in that chain asks the obvious tactical question: are these individuals invisible only to cameras, or also to other systems that rely on heat signatures, motion detectors, automated alarms, missile seekers? The file records a series of tests with primitive field sensors and one with a repurposed seeker head from a portable weapon. The conclusion is unnerving. The devices either fail to lock at all or drift off to background sources. Project Cold Ones is no longer just a curiosity. In a few strokes of a pen, it becomes a potential tool. Soldiers who cannot be seen by enemy sensors. Agents who leave no thermal trail around perimeters. Saboteurs who do not show up on aircraft cameras. Those strokes transform the character of the project. New personnel arrive from central institutes and from the security apparatus. Existing staff who have doubts are reassigned to safe, respectable duties in conventional labs. The remaining team receives an instruction that appears, in softened form, in the minutes of a closed meeting. Determine whether the observed condition can be induced, enhanced, or at least predicted, without compromising the subject's function as living operators. They do not say, without killing them, they imply it. The methods in the next phase stay just inside the line that their own rules paint. They monitor the subjects under different environmental conditions: cold rooms, warm rooms, exercise, rest. They test what happens when the subjects are wrapped in different fabrics, immersed in water, or placed in proximity to large thermal masses. They watch their diets, their sleep, their dreams. A psychological annex, one of the few not heavily redacted, describes the group's shared traits in subdued terms. They are, on average, less expressive than controls. They report fewer dreams involving heat or cold. Several describe themselves as comfortable in drafts or slow to sweat. Their heart rates are slightly lower than average. None of them report feeling strange in the corridor. If anything, they are more unnerved by the attention than by the instruments. One line stands out. Subjects display an unusual awareness of camera placement. They tend to move around the edges of fields of view, even when instructed not to. Whether that trait predated the tests or emerged during them is not recorded. The researchers attempt mild physiological interventions. They give some subjects medications known to affect circulation. They alter their daily routines. Nothing changes the thermal signature. For one subject, the condition appears to deepen. Later tests show almost no measurable infrared emission above background, even in a warm environment. It is at this point that the strange behavior shifts from the cameras to the charts themselves. The technicians at I-52 had a habit of printing out thermal frames onto paper and pinning them on boards for quick comparison. Rows of ghostly false color silhouettes, annotated with grease pencil, filled the walls of certain rooms. During the height of Project Cold Ones, a section of one board was dedicated to the subjects. Frames labeled with their numbers, showing the corridor with either very faint disturbances or none at all. One morning, an assistant entered the control room and found that part of the board blank. The pins were still there, marking out a rectangle, but the paper in between was empty. She assumed someone had removed the frames for closer study. Later, when she mentioned it to a colleague, he looked at her blankly and said that section had always been reserved, waiting for new results. The file contains her statement, taken months later. I remember the images. I remember writing Subject 3 on one of them encircling a faint shape. When I went to point it out, there was nothing there, and they told me I was confusing it with another board. Parallel to that, the internal monitoring system, the one that tracks equipment and document access, begins to show odd edits in the thermal logs. Entries once labeled "no heat trace" are quietly changed to low contrast. References to complete absence on infrared become weak signal near detection threshold. In some cases, the edits can be traced to a specific user account. In many, the system records that the text has changed, but does not assign it to any operator. A security analyst comments dryly, "The archive appears to be adjusting its own language to make the anomaly more acceptable." He receives a directive not to anthropomorphize systems in official reports. The culmination, the event that gets mentioned in the external description as the unusual reaction across the thermal charts, comes during what the project calls the group trial. By then, Project Cold Ones has 6 identified subjects. They are housed in separate quarters, observed, tested, and occasionally brought to the corridor one by one. Someone proposes a combined experiment. All subjects moving through the monitored space together, interacting to see whether their signatures interfere, reinforce, or cancel out. The corridor is reconfigured. Additional sensors are installed, including some experimental prototypes from another institute. The subject group is briefed as far as the project ever briefed anyone. Walk, stop, respond to simple commands. They are told it is a test of camera behavior, not of them. That is as close to honesty as the file ever gets. The recordings from that day are incomplete. Several reels are missing. Others are fogged, partially exposed, or physically damaged. What remains is enough to sketch what happened and enough to raise more questions than answers. On the visible cameras, the group trial starts uneventfully. 6 individuals in identical gray clothing enter the corridor, accompanied by 2 guards. They walk in a line, then in staggered formation, then in pairs. They stop at the marks, turn, shift their weight from foot to foot. They look, to any ordinary observer, like slightly bored volunteers in a dull experiment. On the thermal cameras, the first seconds show something like a set of moving shadows. Vague, cooler patches moving against a warmer background. Not quite silhouettes, not quite absences. The guards, by contrast, are bright forms, their faces shining, breath visible. Then, as the subjects approach the midpoint of the corridor, something changes. Technicians watching later describe it as a falling away of contrast. It is not a glitch in one device. All the thermal feeds at once begin to lose definition, as if the entire corridor is settling into a single, uniform, radiative state. Differences between wall, floor, subjects, guards, even the air, begin to blur. The camera's software does what it was designed to do. It stretches the available range to find something, anything to highlight. It fails. A thin band of static appears at the edge of each frame, then broadens. For a few seconds, the images display something that looks less like a room and more like a flat field of gray noise. Within that, at the very center, a darker, more coherent region pulses once, twice, like a slow heartbeat. In the visible channels, the people are still there, walking, stopping, glancing up. None of them seem aware that in another band of reality they have disappeared. The thermal charts in the control room, a set of live graphs that translate camera data into lines and colors, respond violently. Alarms that should sound only when sensors fail light up. Several graphs flatline, not at 0 but at a median value that corresponds to cannot resolve any difference. Others spike, not in response to any physical heating, but as the system tries to assign meaning to what it is receiving and keeps looping through its own error states. Technicians shout, but their words do not make it into the file. What we have, instead, are their later attempts to describe what they felt. One writes, "It was like looking at a hospital monitor that suddenly decides everyone in the ward has the same pulse, except you can see them moving." Another, "For a moment it felt as if the air had decided to equalize." The strange shift noted by the overseeing security unit occurs in the logs surrounding that moment. Later, when analysts pull the data from the archive, they discover that the textual descriptions of the event disagree with themselves. The same minute is described in one log as complete loss of subject signatures. Room appears empty. In another, accessed a day later, the line reads, temporary saturation of sensors, signatures below resolution. A third version, stored in a backup system, says simply, "No anomaly of operational significance recorded." All three entries have the same timestamp and purported author. The system claims they have not been edited. The human testimonies around that day are equally fractured. Some staff remember one of the guards collapsing in the corridor as if struck by faintness. They recall him being carried out, face gray, complaining that he could not get warm, even in a blanket. They recall seeing frost on the inside of the corridor door, a delicate pattern that melted in seconds. The medical annex lists no such incident. It does mention that one guard was later treated for mild circulatory disturbance, but lists the cause as workload. The page where further explanation might have been written has been torn out. Several technicians report that in the days following the group trial, their own images on the thermal cameras seem weaker. One writes in a private notebook, "When I stand where they stood, I look paler than before. The wall behind me looks brighter." Others claim that nothing changed. The project's supervisors face a choice. Treat this as a breakthrough, evidence that the phenomenon is not just a curious defect in a few individuals, but a state that can spread, or treat it as a limit they dare not cross again. On paper, they take the second path. A closed meeting is held. Its minutes are stripped down to almost nothing. Group trial revealed non-trivial interactions between subject condition and measuring apparatus. Risk of uncontrolled propagation of anomaly cannot be excluded. Recommend suspension of combined tests and reassessment of project goals. Behind that restrained wording, someone scribbles a more candid sentence and then tries to erase it. The graphite ghost remains. We do not know what changed more, the cold ones, the corridor, or us. Security, once excited by the possibilities, shifts into caution. They ask what would happen if a group of soldiers with similar signatures marched through a border network designed to see human heat against the Earth. Would the network merely miss them? Or would the act of passing through rewrite the network's own expectations, making it blind in a wider radius? The project's answer, in a clipped note, is current data insufficient. Further experiments would involve systemic risk. Systemic risk is the phrase you use when a problem stops belonging to one lab and starts possibly belonging to everything connected to it. After that, the documents thin out. There is no dramatic order to cease all activity, no bold line under the word terminate. Instead, you see what looks like a gradual retreat under the cover of normal adjustments. Subjects 1 through 6 are transferred, one by one, to other institutions for medical observation. Their destination files are not attached here. Requests from I-52 to follow up on their condition are delayed, redirected, or denied. A marginal note in one such request reads, "Project ownership transferred. No further local access required." The corridor is dismantled, officially to make room for more conventional calibration work. The infrared cameras are reassigned to other projects. Some are sent to air bases, some end up in storage. One, according to an inventory, is decommissioned due to persistent baseline instability. In the archive at I-52, the thermal prints from the project occupy a section of shelf that, to this day, feels emptier than it should. Several envelopes are marked with the project code but contain only blank paper. A librarian wrote "defective film" on one decades ago. The file here suggests another possibility. An internal audit of the documents, conducted some time after the project was officially closed, finds inconsistencies not just in content but in volume. Entry numbers skip. Cross-references point to annexes that no longer exist. Some pages have clearly been removed by human hands, leaving torn stubs and indentations from staples. Others seem never to have been printed, yet are referenced in indexes. The auditor's report tries to treat this as housekeeping. Project Cold One's documentation exhibits irregular gaps and duplicated numbering. Some discrepancies can be attributed to improper filing practices during active phase. Recommend consolidation and retyping of key summaries to ensure coherent record. A security liaison attached to the audit adds a confidential comment. Significant events described by eyewitnesses are not represented in surviving written materials. Conversely, certain reassuring formulations appear in multiple copies with no clear origin. There is a risk that the archive now tells more about our preferred outcome than about what occurred. This risk is exacerbated by prior involvement of project with self-modifying monitoring tools. It is the closest anyone comes, on paper, to admitting that something about Project Cold Ones may have leaked into the systems used to record it. The last official line in the file, before the usual stamps and closing notes, comes from a late-stage security review. No evidence that individuals with limited or absent infrared signature were successfully trained or deployed in operational contexts. No current indication of such individuals in existing screening data. Residual anomalies in historical records remain unresolved but are assessed as posing no practical threat. Case closed. On the inside of the back cover, where only the archivist's pencil usually reaches, is one more sentence. Hands on their skin felt warmth. Cameras on the wall saw nothing. Paper tried to decide which witness to believe and settled on itself. I am supposed to treat that as an indulgence, not as evidence. It is not signed. It is not indexed. It is not in any directive. It is, however, the most accurate summary of the feeling the file leaves. You can explain parts of Project Cold Ones in ways that let you sleep. Perhaps the maintenance worker's condition was a rare quirk of circulation. Perhaps the others had a cluster of traits that made them register weakly on flawed early-generation sensors. Perhaps the apparent spread of the phenomenon through the corridor was nothing more than a system pushed beyond its design, vomiting nonsense that scared people into hearing patterns. But that does not quite account for the way the language around the project kept softening, the way certain phrases vanished from logs without anyone admitting to editing them, the way the same event acquired multiple coexisting descriptions, each less alarming than the last. We assume, without thinking about it, that if something is alive, it will show up as warmth against a colder world. We build instruments, protocols, and threats around that assumption. The people who started Project Cold Ones thought they were hunting a useful exception. Somewhere along the way, they realized they might be chewing at the edges of their own ability to tell that life is present at all. The USSR wanted humans with no heat trace. In the controlled concrete corridor of I-52, they found some, or convinced their sensors they had. Whether they truly understood what that meant, physically, psychologically, systemically, is less clear. The file survives as a stack of thinning paper that still feels chilly to the touch, even in a warm reading room. It tells a story of individuals who were hard to see in the band of reality the state cared most about, of networks that twitched and tried to adjust, of words that faded on the page. There is no record here of anyone creating more of them on purpose. There is no unit roster listing cold operators, no proud report of a successful mission invisible to thermal eyes. Maybe that never happened. Maybe it did, but those files are colder and deeper than this one. Or maybe the real legacy of Project Cold Ones is not a squad of ghosts in uniforms, but a quieter, more unsettling shift. Somewhere, in some section of the system's memory, a learned habit of occasionally not seeing what is undeniably there when you touch it. The instruments say nothing is moving. The room feels crowded. The paper insists it remembers everything faithfully. The pencil in the cover disagrees just enough to make you wonder which witness you have chosen to trust.